Why did some aircraft engines explode mid-flight, whilst others purred perfectly? Henry Tizard found the answer in a single number and changed aviation forever. 1916, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard. But here's what they didn't tell you in history class. Most pilots weren't shot down. They were betrayed by their own machines. British fighter planes would climb, bank, turn, then suddenly, violently, the engine would seize. Metal tearing, pistons shattering, and 10,000 feet became a death sentence with no parachute, no second chance. The Royal Flying Corps was bleeding pilots faster than they could train them, and nobody knew why. Engineers blamed the designs, pilots blamed bad luck, commanders blamed cowardice. But one man, a quiet chemist named Henry Tizard, suspected something else entirely: the fuel. Henry Tizard wasn't supposed to save aviation. Born in 1885, he was a scholar, Oxford educated, brilliant with equations, awkward with people. The sort of man who found beauty in chemical formulae, whilst others found it in poetry. When the Great War erupted, Tizard didn't rush to the trenches. He went to the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough. Because whilst other scientists saw chemistry as theory, Tizard saw it as survival. And he noticed something everyone else had missed. 2 identical aircraft. Same design, same pilot skill, same weather conditions. One would soar to 15,000 feet without hesitation. The other would cough, sputter, and shake itself apart at 8,000. The difference wasn't the plane, it was what you poured into it. Fuel in 1916 wasn't fuel, it was chaos in a tin. Refineries mixed whatever crude oil they had available. One batch might be smooth, the next might be volatile. Pilots were essentially flying bombs, never knowing if their next maneuver would be their last. But why? What made one fuel safe and another deadly? Tizard began experimenting. Not in fighter planes, too dangerous, too expensive, but in laboratory engines. Controlled environments, measured conditions, scientific precision. He discovered that when fuel burnt inside an engine cylinder, it didn't always burn smoothly. Sometimes it would detonate, exploding all at once instead of burning in a controlled wave. Engineers called this knocking. Tizard called it a death sentence. The knock wasn't just annoying, it created shockwaves that cracked pistons, destroyed bearings, and turned precision engines into scrap metal. At high altitudes, where air was thin and engines strained hardest, the knocking became catastrophic. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all fuels knocked equally. Tizard tested fuel after fuel, mixture after mixture. He compressed them, heated them, pushed them to their breaking points. And he found that some chemical structures resisted knocking, whilst others embraced it like a suicide pact. He needed a way to measure this, a scale, a number that would tell pilots, engineers, and fuel manufacturers, this fuel will kill you, this fuel will save you. Tizard took 2 reference fuels. One was heptane, a straight-chain hydrocarbon that knocked violently, unpredictably, lethally. He called this 0, the baseline of danger. The other was iso-octane, a branched hydrocarbon that burnt smooth, steady, reliable. He called this 100, the gold standard. Every other fuel could now be measured between these extremes. If your fuel performed like a mix of 80% iso-octane and 20% heptane, you had 80-octane fuel. Simple, quantifiable, revolutionary. Suddenly, aviation had a language. Fighter squadrons knew what they were putting in their tanks. Engineers could design engines around specific fuel grades. Refineries could finally produce consistent, reliable fuel instead of liquid roulette. British aircraft performance jumped overnight. Engines that once struggled at 8,000 feet now climbed to 15,000, 18,000, 20,000 feet. Pilots who once feared their own machines now trusted them. The octane rating didn't just improve engines, it saved the Royal Air Force. But Tizard wasn't finished, because whilst he'd solved one war, another was coming. And this time the stakes would be higher than anyone imagined. By the 1930s, Tizard's octane system had spread worldwide. Every aviation fuel on Earth was measured by his scale. His name should have been legendary. Instead, it was almost forgotten, because what Tizard did next wasn't about fuel or engines, it was about something far more dangerous. A technology so powerful that Churchill himself called it the Wizard War. And Tizard would gamble everything: his reputation, his country's secrets, even the outcome of the Second World War, on a single, desperate mission across the Atlantic. Here's something to think about. Tizard's octane rating saved thousands of pilots in the Great War, but did it actually make the war worse by making air combat more effective? Henry Tizard invented the octane rating, the number that saved the Royal Air Force in the Great War. But by the 1930s, fuel wasn't his concern anymore, because Britain was about to face something far worse, and Tizard would have to make a decision that still divides engineers today. 1933, Hitler takes power in Germany. Whilst diplomats talked peace, Tizard saw war, not in 5 years, not in 10, soon. And Britain wasn't ready. The Royal Air Force had aeroplanes, certainly. Brave pilots, absolutely. But courage doesn't stop bombers. Fuel ratings don't detect enemy aircraft in the dark. And radar, the technology that could see what human eyes couldn't, was still a laboratory dream. Tizard became chairman of the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence in 1935. His mission turned science fiction into survival. He didn't invent radar, but he did something perhaps more important. He made it work. Whilst other scientists argued about frequencies and theories, Tizard built a chain of radar stations along Britain's coast. Towers that could detect German aircraft 100 miles away. 100 miles. That's 15 minutes of warning. 15 minutes to scramble fighters, organise defences, save cities. Without that system, the Battle of Britain would have been a slaughter. With it, Britain survived. But survival wasn't victory, and Tizard knew it. By 1940, Britain was alone. France had fallen. The Soviet Union had a pact with Hitler. America was neutral, watching from across the Atlantic whilst Europe burnt. Churchill's government faced a brutal calculation: fight alone and lose slowly, or find an ally and bet everything. Tizard proposed something radical, something that made military commanders physically ill. Give America our secrets, all of them. Not just radar, everything. The cavity magnetron, a device that made radar 10 times more powerful. Jet engine designs, explosive research, anti-submarine technology. Every scientific advantage Britain had clawed from years of desperate research. The military establishment was horrified. You're handing Hitler's next victims a manual on how we defend ourselves, they argued. What if America stays neutral? What if this technology falls into German hands? Tizard's response was coldly logical. If we don't share it, we lose alone. If we share it, we might win together. Dead men keep no secrets. But here's what made this decision truly extraordinary. Tizard wasn't gambling with theories. He was gambling with technology that represented billions of pounds in research, thousands of man-hours, and Britain's only technical advantage over Germany. And he was carrying it across the Atlantic in a single trip. September 1940. Tizard boarded a ship to America with a team of scientists and a cargo that would be called the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. The cavity magnetron alone was worth an army. This device, a copper cylinder barely larger than a fist, could generate microwave radiation powerful enough to detect a submarine periscope from an aeroplane. German U-boats, which had been sinking Allied ships with impunity, would suddenly become visible. But it was fragile. One drop, one German bomb hitting the ship, one navigational error, and years of research would sink to the Atlantic floor. Tizard carried backup copies of nothing. This was everything, in one basket, crossing an ocean filled with German submarines. The mission, later called the Tizard Mission, arrived in Washington and met with American scientists. The atmosphere was skeptical. America had its own researchers, its own pride. Why did they need British charity? Then Tizard opened the boxes. American scientists couldn't believe what they were seeing. Technology they'd been theorising about for years fully realised. Problems they'd been stuck on solved. The cavity magnetron alone represented a quantum leap. One American researcher later wrote, "The most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores." But here's what the history books often miss. This wasn't just about technology, it was about trust. Tizard didn't demand patents, he didn't negotiate payment, he didn't require credit. He handed over Britain's crown jewels and said, "Build them, use them, win with them," and America did. The cavity magnetron became the heart of Allied radar systems. It detected German submarines, it guided bombers through clouds, it turned the invisible visible. American factories, with their vast industrial capacity, mass-produced devices that British workshops could barely make in dozens. The technology Tizard carried multiplied 1,000-fold. By 1943, the Atlantic was no longer Germany's hunting ground. By 1944, Allied bombers struck with precision. By 1945, the war was won. Would it have been won without Tizard's mission? Perhaps. Eventually. With how many more lives lost? Henry Tizard never became a household name. He never won a Nobel Prize. His octane rating system is printed on every fuel pump on Earth, but without his name. He gave away Britain's secrets and saved the world. Some call it strategy, others call it desperation. Tizard called it necessity. Here's the real question. If you were Tizard in 1940, could you have handed over your country's only advantages to a neutral nation? Or would you have held back, just in case? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.